welcoming everybody to this webinar, Ask the Experts about winter care for shrubs. I'm Diane Blazek. I'm the Executive Director for National Garden Bureau, who is sponsoring this series of webinars. We also have Gail Pabst on the call. Wave, Gail, there she is. So she's going to be kind of monitoring things on the side. And what I wanted, two things. If you put your Zoom, go up to the upper right, and if you put it on speaker view, then it's going to really help, and you'll be able to actually see our panelists as they speak. Otherwise, you're going to have a whole big screen of a lot of different people because we're using meeting format instead of webinar format. So that's one thing. And also get ready in just a minute. After I introduce our speakers, I'm going to put a poll on the screen, and the poll is going to ask which region you're from, because I think that's going to help direct our conversation. And I'm also going to ask which shrub you're most concerned about overwintering. So let me introduce the speakers. And if everybody could, please put yourself on mute, or else we'll have to do that. But if you put yourself on mute, that's going to help everybody be able to hear our presenters. So let's get going with this. And I'm going to introduce Sam Schmitz from Ball Horticultural Company. There he is with the nice blue sky, and that's real. That's not a fake sky behind him. And Jim Putman from the Southern Living Plant Collection. And he has a blue wall behind him. So today's kind of a blue day, I think. So I'm going to post the poll, and then I'm going to let Jim and Sam just introduce themselves briefly and talk a little bit about their background, their companies, and their knowledge of shrubs, and then we'll get moving into our questions. So who's going to go first, Jim or Sam?
Okay,
Jim, go ahead.
Okay, all right. I am, hold on, let me fill out your survey real quick. Southeast, I'm in the Southeast. My name is Jim Putnam. I'm with Plant Development Services Incorporated, which is Southern Living Plant Collection and Encore Azaleas and the Sunset Plant Collection as well. I also have a YouTube channel called HortTube where I teach gardening to folks all over the United States and the world. But I do a lot of work with the plants from the Southern Living Plant Collection.
Great. And Sam?
Cool. Yeah, as Diane said, I'm with Ball Horticultural. I did my undergraduate in ornamental horticulture at U of I, Champaign-Urbana. I stayed on there. I got a master's degree in turf management. Spent about 5.5 years in landscape contracting before I ended up at Ball. And at Ball, pretty much, we've had a 60-acre campus. If it's outside of a building and it's green, it's pretty much mine to maintain. Spring, summer, fall, winter, whether it's storm pruning, mid-season pruning, that kind of stuff, from annual flowers all the way through, the larger trees that we have on site, the specimen plants. Been working with those hands-on now for close to 25 years as my career, even when I was in college. All of my old kind of temporary jobs, summer jobs as a student, even in high school, was all outside doing this kind of work. So it's just put in a lot of time with pairs of pruners and lawnmowers and spray equipment and all that kind of fun stuff.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So it looks like our poll, the majority of people on our call today are from the Midwest, Great Plains, and then the Southeast, which is absolutely perfect because Sam is in the Midwest and Jim is in the Southeast. We also have a good representation from Northeast. So thank you to everyone for participating in that poll. As far as which shrubs people are interested in, this does not surprise me at all. The top two are hydrangeas and roses. So we'll definitely make sure that when we answer some of these questions, if there's anything specific with a hydrangea or a rose, you guys can remember to add that in. Hardy hibiscus also. So that's the top three. So we'll end with those. I'm going to end the poll now. And, share results. I forgot that I could do that as the host. So we've got that. So let's start back with, should we cut back shrubs before winter? So you're going to have to address this, I'm pretty sure, maybe by type of shrub and maybe by region. So I'll let you guys take it away.
For the most part, no. There's really no reason to. I'll let Sam spend some time on snow load because he's going to be more familiar with the potential for snow to do damage to some plants. And I address that with a butterfly bush that I have in my backyard currently that just looks like it would be a disaster if it got snowed on. Typically, I wouldn't prune it until late winter, but it just looks like the perfect plant to be killed by snow or be destroyed by the snow. So for the most part here in the Southeast, we're not going to be pruning on anything. Plus, I think it would be very difficult to go through the entire list of shrubs that you would or wouldn't now because they have flower buds on them potentially for the spring. And I also think that if you're just looking at like an evergreen shrub, like a holly or a boxwood or something like that, if you butchered on it right now, that's how it would look for the winter, whether you damaged it or didn't damage it. I don't want to look at it bare for the winter, really. So, Sam.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I share a lot of those same sentiments. If it's a spring flowering shrub, definitely don't prune it now. And I mean, like you said, there's an extraordinarily long list of plants that flower in the spring. Lilacs come to mind. If you prune them now, even if you prune them late winter, you're not going to have any flowers in the spring. So a lot of those you have to wait till they're done flowering, prune them. Hydrangeas, viburnums, they already have flower buds on them. You prune them now, you're not getting any flower out of them. The buddleia up in the Midwest, where we are just outside of Chicago, they're almost more than likely going to die back to the ground almost every winter. So for us, we let them go, and if they make it, they make it. If not, we'll hack them off the ground 8 inches up, and we'll let them go. In terms of snow load, there's a whole host of snow questions I know that were in this as well. That's a whole other topic. Snow gets kind of tricky. Certain flowers, certain plants, if they're from the Midwest, they're native to our area, they'll either handle the snow load by being remarkably rigid or incredibly flexible. So they can usually take it. I've seen buddleia 6 foot tall bend over the ground in snow load and just sit there bent for months. And then the snow melts and they stand back up and the stems are okay. If it's something that is out of its element a little bit, not used to snow, but will make it, again, you kind of have to play those by ear based on what you have in your garden. But yeah, from the pruning standpoint, no, there's really no need to cut it back right now. The other thing I was going to say, I'm glad I remember this, when you mentioned boxwoods, hollies, Southeast, they probably go through the winters without too many difficulties. Up in this area, especially the Midwest, we get cold, and we get cold with no snow cover a lot. If we prune in the fall, now you have a lot of open wounds on the ends of those branches. It's a prime candidate for then desiccating from those cuts down. And then you could, if you want to prune 4 inches off the top of your holly, you may end up taking another 8 to 10 inches off in the spring because of the desiccation that was caused through those open wounds and the cuts that weren't able to properly heal before winter set in. So again, pruning now before winter, unless it's absolutely necessary, it's going to be blocking a driveway, they're going to lean over a sidewalk, they're covering an emergency door, something where safety is a concern over the health of the plant material. I would say leave them alone until really late winter, early spring. The snow starts to melt, things are coming around, you're looking on the upside of day length and all that kind of fun stuff. And then you should be in the clear at that point.
So you used a word that I think it might make sense to explain, which was desiccation. So
Yeah.
can you talk about that and also address it? Like, I think there's sprays maybe, and are those recommended or not recommended?
Desiccation is basically the plant drying out. If there are leaves, even stems, buds on the plant during the winter, there's a potential for those to dry out. The plant, if you get a nice, warm, sunny winter day, but the ground is frozen, it will still try to metabolize. It will try to move water. If it can't, because the ground is frozen, it can't pull any new moisture in, the only course it has is to simply lose water from where it already is. It's kind of like watching ice cubes or ice outside melt but not form a puddle. They just kind of, the ice just disappears on those warm, sunny winter days where the air is really dry and it's cold. It just evaporates. It disappears without forming a puddle. And the plant does the same thing. The moisture gets drawn right out of the leaves, right out of the stems, especially with broadleaf evergreens, and they can't replace that moisture, so they just dry out more and more and more. There are sprays that you could use. It's usually something that will form a waxy coating over the leaves to try to basically encapsulate them in a wax where they're not losing that moisture. Couple of things could happen there. If you have a warmer, wet winter and it rains a lot, or if it's wet, heavy snow with a lot of moisture in it, you could break those coatings down. They might not last the full winter, so you run the risk of then having desiccation late in the season and them drying out a little bit later. If you have a really, really dry winter and you go into spring and those coatings are still on, you may need to do something to those coatings early in the spring to get them to break down before the plant tries to metabolize, and it can't because it's literally encapsulated in wax, and you end up suffocating the leaves as they try to breathe, as they try to respirate. So there's a use for them. They get a little tricky. If you apply right, you probably don't have a lot of issues. I think the bigger thing is making sure you put plants in the right place, things that are suited for your environment, suited for the particular area that you have. Usually you could find a microclimate, a little niche somewhere in the garden that some of the broadleaf evergreens, other plants that are a little bit more prone to winter drying out, winter burn, they could survive better than if you just put them out, say, like in the middle of this field where they're going to dry out like crazy. Like that, that could help too. Oh, drop something there.
It's your list of questions. No worries. I'll keep answering them. But I think you brought up something that we hear a lot, right plant, right place. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about that, especially from the Southeast region, right plant, right place? Because I think you're dealing with the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be a lot of heat and humidity.
We have a lot of heat and humidity, but everyone, regardless of where they are living, want to put something in the landscape that is not hardy in their area. I don't care. You can live in the center of Florida. They want even more tropical things. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. Everybody wants this. And so I think, when you're pushing the boundary on plants, like everyone, literally everyone, the right place, right thing, having them around the envelope of your house, knowing the area that you live in, because honestly, out in some of the suburban areas around our cities, they can be 2 or 3 degrees colder at night, and I'm in a very urban environment. I've got asphalt road, and there's not a lot of wind movement through here. So I know for my landscape, although I'm in zone 7B, I can get away with a lot of stuff from 8A and even 8B, where other people can't. So some of it becomes learning the space that you're in, and then putting those vulnerable things up against foundations. I mean, and out of the direct, out of direct wind, out of harm's way, so to speak. But everyone is pushing the boundary. What I say about this, and I think this is key, is I don't fall plant things that I'm pushing the boundaries on. So here in the Southeast, particularly, we're continuing to plant. In fact, fall is the best time to be planting. But if something is marginally hardy, this is not the day to put it in November 5th. The day to put that in is April 15th or May 1st, and it has a full season to establish itself before it goes into this first winter. So that's kind of my take on the right place, and timing, plant time, the timing of the planting is as important as anything.
That's perfect. And when you say pushing the boundaries, one of the things that we like to do in our blogs is we have something called beginner tips. And so I think maybe one of you can just address a little bit zones. We probably have a lot of very experienced gardeners on here, but for any newbie gardeners, talk a little bit about zones. How does somebody find their zones? Microclimates in your on your property. How do you determine a microclimate? Just kind of a gardener 101 on those topics.
Take that, or you want to go ahead?
I mean, I'll jump in for a little bit on this one. We can go back and forth. So, as you mentioned, you said 7A.
I'm in 7B, probably almost 8. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, we're in. It's weird. Chicago proper in downtown is probably 6A. We're just further out. We're maybe 30 miles west of the city, so we're about 5A. So it's a huge difference just between. Anyway, for the zones, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has a map of the entire United States stretching into a little bit of northern Mexico, southern Canada. That is broken up. It's usually color, so it's really easy to tell. And there are 10, 11 different hardiness zones, each with an A and a B. And where you are in the United States kind of determines what zone you're in based on how cold sustained expected temperatures are during the winter months. So, for instance, 5A, 5B stretches, it kind of weaves its way through Colorado, maybe bits of Iowa, through the Chicago region, and then further off to the east. And it's not a straight band. And there are bits and pieces that work their way in based on how close you are to, say, the Great Lakes, mountainous regions. That will all affect your hardiness zone and how cold it will get during the winter months. There are times where the Chicago area will experience, 4A temperatures, which is typically very northern Wisconsin, where you're minus 20, minus 25 as your high temps for a week straight with no snow cover. There are times in the winter where we'll probably be closer with 6A or 6B all winter, which is maybe 0 degrees, 5 or 10 above, and we don't get much colder than that. And those are the extremes. So nothing is black and white when it comes to plants. When it comes to weather, too. I mean, everything is kind of up in the air when it comes to those hardiness zones. And then, Jim, you touched on the microclimate thing a little bit with up against foundation. So if you want to take that side of it, be my guest.
Yeah, and one other thing on the zone map is it was originally just zone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then they more recently divided this A and B thing, and this has confused people. But it took us from 10-degree average low temperatures to 5-degree average low temperature. So the difference between me being in 7B, where our average low temperature every winter is 10, where 7A, the average low temperature is 5, and 6B is 0, so on and so forth. I may be off 5 degrees, but that's what it is, 5-degree difference. And 5 degrees will make all the difference in the world for some plants. I mean, roots are killed at very specific temperatures. This is science, but where an azalea root in a container might be killed at exactly 10 degrees or exactly 13. And so that 5 degrees is significant. And then, but within our spaces, like Sam was just saying, especially if you're in a mountain area, you can get 3 zones within a 50-mile ride, really quickly. And so depending on where you live, and again, I'm 3 blocks from North Carolina State University in a very urban space. And for us, without wind and with all this asphalt jungle, we're basically in 8A, even though on the map I'm in zone 7B. And you'll determine that. I mean, you can at my nursery, I had a 25-acre nursery in the spot where I parked my vehicles. Every single morning had frost on the windows, but you could take 50 steps to a plant bed nearby and have no frost on them whatsoever. There can be a 2-degree difference within even the yard that you have. And so you'll learn those things. I don't know that there's definitely the envelope of the house obviously has heat, but you may find Like Sam said when he showed you the background he's in, if you put a plant that's barely hardy in your area in the middle of a field, you are inviting, you're inviting winter problems from desiccation. You're also inviting even problems in the sun with, drought's going to be more severe on that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, good. And we can always circle back to some of these things because we might be talking about certain types of shrubs that have certain microclimates. So we can definitely circle back. We were talking about desiccation, pruning, which is a no. What about doing other things before winter? Mulching, wrapping it with burlap, packing leaves around the shrubs. Any recommendations there? Should you do it? Should you not do it? Do you do it for certain shrubs and not for others?
Start us off, Sam.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's always an interesting one because it comes up, and we were talking a little bit before everybody was in the room about us doing a whole bunch of things to plants, and we sometimes try to do too much. I mean, the plants themselves know what they need to do, so us helping them along at times isn't necessary. That being said, some of those marginally hardy shrubs, especially again in the Midwest, if you have macrophylla hydrangeas, which are the big kind of pink and blue flowered hydrangeas, those guys, the root systems, very hardy. They'll survive winters with no problem. The problem is the flower buds are born on this year's growth for next season. And those flower buds rarely survive the winter. I mean, you get one of those nice big giant blue hydrangeas from your local garden center, big box store, wherever you buy stuff from. You put it in your yard. The first year looks great. The next year it doesn't have flowers, and you assume it's something you did wrong. It's not. That plant the top of that plant just isn't hardy. So something like that, taking those styrofoam kind of rose cages, or even putting burlap around it and filling it with leaves, so you're protecting the upper portion of the plant from hard freezes, from the freeze-thaw cycle, from a lot of ice and snow. Those types of things can help. But again, you just have to make sure you do that right. If you bury them too early, leave them buried too late, now you're in a situation where everything is wet, the stems are wet, the leaves are wet, the buds are wet, at a time when fungal growth and other microbial activity could be very, very high. And then you're inviting those stems to literally rot while you're trying to protect them. So doing things like that, burying them, you just have to make sure you got your timing right. In terms of wrapping trees and shrubs, again, you could do that from two different standpoints. If you're worried about them collapsing in a snow load, you could wrap it really, really tight. Try to keep those branches from falling over. Again, those are the ones that may not be suited for the area where there's snow. If they're, something that's from the Midwest, from somewhere that gets snow, they should have their own mechanisms to be able to handle that. And even if they do break, you could do a little bit of pruning in the spring. The buds that were dormant before, they'll break, they'll fill that shrub back in. It may take a season or so if you have a lot of damage to get that looking the way you want it again, but it will survive. Again, a little bit further off, but with smaller trees, thin-barked trees, say beech trees, maples, for the first couple of seasons, wrapping the trunks of those with a burlap or even plastic drain tube I've seen, just to eliminate the rapid freeze thaw that they experience with the sap under the bark, could be highly beneficial. In the Midwest, and Jim, I don't know if you have this where you are, but we have something we call Southwest damage. Up in the Midwest, the sun, as it sets, is very low in the sky, and it's in the West, obviously, the sun sets in the West. So the warmest time of the day will heat the bark up, and the sap will actually start to flow under the bark in very, very young trees, very thin bark trees. It'll warm up to the point where it starts to flow. It gets loose, it starts to move, sun sets, and it immediately drops 15, 20 degrees, and it freezes instantly. And the bark can actually split in the winter because of that rapid freezing. And you do it over and over again, and you'll end up with these giant 3 to 4 foot long wounds, maybe a ½ inch wide, down the side of your brand new maple tree, beech tree. Some birch trees will do that, and you wonder what happened to this thing, and it's literally just freezing and thawing. So plants like that, it could actually help in the area. Again, roses with a little dome over the top, protecting the upper foliage and the upper stems. So yeah, you can do it. You just have to be careful that you're not leaving it on too long, where you can cause rot and actually be detrimental to the health of the plant.
Here in the Southeast, we don't, especially on the east side of the Appalachian Mountains, we just don't have a lot of winter wind, like we have in the Midwest. So we get a lot less of that type of damage. And so you won't see many people wrapping, trees and shrubs as much here. The one actual issue we have in the South, what I want to say, if you are thinking about protecting plants, dormancy is super, super important. You've got to let plants go dormant. It is the number one key to the safety of a plant in the wintertime, is to actually let it go fully to sleep. If you start protecting things because it's 35 degrees outside, what's going to happen when it's really cold is going to be very problematic. So you got to let it ramp down. The only thing you should need to protect a plant from that's hardy in your area is temperatures that go below those average norms. And so if I say my average low temperature is 10 degrees in my area, if I'm going to see 0 or -5, which is possible, it happens about every 30 years here or so, then that's something I'm going to have to, to think about. But as an example of this, I did a little Gulf Coast tour trip, looking at plants from the Southern Living Plant Collection, a lot of different nurseries in the spring. And one of the plants that is most damaged in nursery settings in the Southeast, butterfly bush, because down on the Gulf Coast, they don't go to sleep. So when it freezes, they're actually killed. It's a plant that's hardied all the way to Canada in the ground. It's not even, so I want to stress that. Don't freak out and start protecting things during minor cold snaps. Otherwise, they can be severely damaged when actual cold comes. Yeah.
Very good. I'm going to jump in. And I forgot to tell everybody, if you had questions, just put them in the chat function. So I'm going to jump in with a couple of these. I like to get these questions answered as we go along. Her 9-barks and Japanese maples are showing fungus on the leaves right now. She's in Maryland, which I think she said was 7B. Should she ignore them or treat them before the winters? Jim?
I think it's a miracle that those leaves lasted this long looking that great. You should celebrate the season that it wasn't a problem until they were about to lose their leaves. And so the only thing I would say is, if you do have foliar issues on plants, those are probably leaves I'm going to remove and dispose of, as opposed to using them as mulch. But other than that, thank goodness they made it this long looking that great.
Congratulations. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, here's another question. I've recently planted a lavender twist weeping redbud. It was balled and burlapped, but has only been in the ground for 3 weeks. Should I overwinter it? Christine Kramer, if you can put your zone or location, that would really help answer. Here's another one from North Texas. We typically also have southwest injury. What about wrapping the trunks? So this would be trees, not shrubs, of young maples and certain red oaks.
I could do that one. So yeah, the wrapping the trunks of the trees in the winter definitely helps. It provides just a little bit of insulation. It helps slow down that freeze thaw cycle. But again, once they go pretty much dormant, you could wrap those trunks. A little thin layer isn't going to do it. If you're going to wrap it like you mean it. I mean, you're really trying to insulate that tree and keep it from that really, really quick freeze thaw that happens. So that could definitely help with those with the maples, and like you said, the thinner barked young trees, to get them until they have that nice thick bark layer. Once they have that, they'll be on their own. They can handle it. It's just very, very young trees. trees usually grow in a forest where there's a lot of other protection. We put them out in the middle of nowhere, so they don't have a lot of protection from other shrubbery and small and other trees that are around them to keep the sun off of them and keep that freeze thaw to a minimum. So yeah, they need a little bit of assistance from us when we put them out somewhere where they're not really used to growing.
Great. On that redbud, on the redbud question, real quick, I would put it in the ground almost no matter where you live. They're hardy in like zone 5 to 9, and that thing's going to be better off in the ground than it is in a container. Keep in mind with your container plants, I'm guessing up at some point during this, is that the things I have in my containers outside for the winter are 2 zones hardier than where I live. I think that's a pretty good way to determine whether or not you can leave a container outside. So for me, like a boxwood in a container, I'm in zone 7, they're hardy up to zone 5. That plant, the pot can just freeze solid as long as the container is not one that will bust in the winter. But you're talking about that with that redbud, it's going to be better off in the ground, insulated and mulched. So there you go.
Okay, I think the redbud is in the ground, so it's been in the ground for 3 weeks.
What you're talking about?
The zone was 6A. So is there anything special to overwinter? It sounds like it might be fine on its own.
Yeah, as long as they mulched it and they didn't bury the graft. That's, a lot of these just make sure the graft is above the ground and and it's in the ground and it's mulched.
Okay, so we have to talk about volcano mulching then. We have to address that. You brought up the graft. Right. Let's talk about that.
I have a very popular couple videos on my channel just going around and follow landscapers around and watch them do this. I think the big issue with people putting too much mulch up on their plants is they see professionals do it.
Yeah.
And a person who's presenting themselves as a professional doing it. And that's really the problem, is that I see a lot of our cultural, a lot of our issues for home gardeners is related to the fact that, we don't necessarily have professionals out in the, in our commercial landscapes. So, but yeah, you want to keep the ground covered. It's very important for moisture. It's very important for weed control. It's very important for we can just go on and on about, the earth is trying to cover itself all the time and humans are busy uncovering it. Think about this, everything that's not covered on earth in mulch is a desert or an ocean or a rock, and that's not what you're trying to have. So do keep it covered. Keeping the ground covered is super important, but don't cover anything that wasn't covered in the container that
And even sorry, I was going to add a little bit on that, because what I see a lot in our area is when especially with container grown plants, it's usually okay. It's with ball and burlap, when they dig it and they wrap it high. Yeah. So unless you unwrap it and start moving a little bit of the dirt and find that flare, I've seen them planted at the top of the burlap, or nobody removes any of the burlap and it's wrapped up too tight. And then you end up planting a tree 2 to 3 inches below where its root system actually is, and which is also a big no-no. That you lead to a lot of rot issues. You could stall that tree. The roots you could end up too deep. Not a good situation to find yourself in. So, like you said, mulching is important. Planting at the right depth is important. Just make sure you uncover that flare and you know where that is.
So here's another terminology question. You're talking about flare. Is the graft the same as the root flare / crown? So if you can address that.
No. Well, you go ahead, Sam.
No, that was going to be about my answer as well.
Right. Yeah.
No, on some of those trees, like you said, that there's a lavender twist redbud. The top of that tree and the bottom of that tree are 2 different trees that somebody cut apart and put together. And that graft union usually happens right near the soil level. The root flare, not at the soil level, but a couple inches above. So you need to look at where that graft union is. You find that root flare. Both of those should be, the root flare should be at grade. The graft union should definitely be above grade, so you don't bury either of them.
Yeah.
Because that graft union, if the graft union is still young, it's a major wound that may still be healing. You need that exposed, you need that open, you need that healthy. If you bury a wound, it's going to fester. You need that opening to let it breathe, and so it could heal itself properly over time.
Yeah, I think if this is something that once you see it, you'll know what we're talking about. Where a tree goes into the ground, it should be slightly wider as it goes into the ground. That's what the root flare is. And we could probably go through commercial landscapes all over the city of Raleigh today. Root flares don't exist, where I can tell that tree's just going straight into the ground.
There's a big root flare for you right there.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
a root
Sam's
flare.
going to show us. Yeah,
There
there's.
you go. There's a nice big root flare. This big, this is
Yeah.
something above me. So there you go.
It's nice to have a panelist who's out of doors and we can get those actual examples. So that's good. I don't think we've talked about fertilizing. When should you stop fertilizing your shrubs before winter sets in?
June. Yeah, that's probably about the right answer. I only fertilize. Fertilizing, number one, fertilizing is just way overdone in general. I mean, if we are, we should be feeding our plants by keeping the ground covered, like I said earlier. And so I put out a small amount of fertilizer as my things are waking up in the late winter and into maybe middle spring, and I'm done. I feel like we've all been oversold on what's actually required in the landscape. And we should be feeding our plants the way nature does, which is just recycling the things that we're cutting off of our plants back in right onto the ground. So yeah.
Good tip. I love that so many of the tips that you guys are giving are just back off. It's a lot easier than you think.
Right,
Just,
yeah, right.
just
Yeah,
plant
right.
them
Yeah,
and
right.
let them go. Don't over mulch, don't over fertilize, don't over water, which does bring me to another question that I had. What about watering in a dry winter? And Jim, you might have a different answer than Sam, being in different regions. Does this mean we have to go out and measure our precipitation? How do you know that you're having a dry winter where it warrants some additional manual watering rather than letting Mother Nature take over?
Good, Jim. You want to? Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I'll jump in, I guess. So yeah, in the Midwest, my biggest worries, because we do have dry winters. We do have very wet winters from time to time. My worry with watering during a wet winter or a dry winter, if it's warm and dry and you're above freezing, the ground is thawed, there's moisture moving through the soil profile, but we haven't had any rain in many, many weeks or any snow in many weeks, you might be able to do that. The worry is if the soil is still relatively frozen, or if it's thawed a little bit on the top but frozen underneath. All you're going to do if you try to water, you fill up the rest of the soil profile with water, and then it freezes solid. Oxygen doesn't like to move through ice. Roots need oxygen. Even in the winter, it's not bad to have a little bit of oxygen in that root zone. So when the ground is at field capacity, where there's not excess moisture, the soil is wet, but it's not mud. There's still a lot of open airspace and open pore space in the soil for oxygen to move back and forth, even through the snow. It's fluffy. You can get a little bit air movement through there. The roots still need to breathe. They're not doing much. They don't need a lot of oxygen, but they still need a little bit of airflow. If you fill that upper layer of the soil and then freeze it solid, your air exchange is almost completely eliminated from the upper soil surface or the atmosphere through that upper soil surface. So again, it's something that usually in the fall, we've got plenty of moisture. If your plants are well watered and they're healthy going into the fall, they should be able to handle those winter months, especially if they're already dormant. They don't have any leaves left on them. Evergreens, broadleaf evergreens might be a little bit different situation, but if they're suited for the area, they're planted in the right locations, they should be, if we get a normal amount of rainfall in the fall, they should be perfectly fine going through the winter, even if it's dry. even if there's no snow cover. You know, you could cause more harm than good if you try to do something and it doesn't work the way you think it's going to work. And again, you end up freezing your plants into the ice, and then they're completely cut off.
Right. I would, I said fall is for planting earlier here in the Southeast, and it is the best time of year to plant. But September, October, and early November are actually our driest time of the year. Normally in the Southeast, it rains. We get 45 inches of rain on average here. By the time you get back to Louisiana, they're getting 65 inches of rain here. But in the fall, this is our dry time. So as we're planting new things here where the ground doesn't freeze, you do want to be on top of it. Keep in mind, though, with the shorter days and the cooler nights, the water lasts longer. And so, I'm a big proponent of go and check it. There's no possibility that anyone can tell you how to water your plants and your condition and your soil type, your area of the country. If you go over to the plant and you just dig down a couple inches with your finger, if it feels moist, walk away from it and relax. If it's dry, then water it. And I like to do a drown and forget philosophy with watering. If it does get dry, really throw the water to it, but then walk away. Let it actually become dry. I can go back on landscape jobs that I had over the years where people had irrigation systems. They were constantly watering without actually checking. I could pop 3-gallon plants out of the ground like they had never, 2 or 3 years in the ground. They had never rooted. They had no reason to. So we want to stress plants a little bit, just a little bit. I'm not telling you to stress them to the point of hurting them, but that stress is what makes them go out and root out into the surrounding areas, make relationships with the other fungi and things, everything else. And so it's important that we stress them a little.
Well, and on that point with the irrigation systems, we get too complacent, I believe, at times with, I have an irrigation system. I'll put some water on, and you put a little bit of water on. And then, tomorrow it looks a little dry. I'll put a little water on. But we never really take into consideration what happens when it rains. When it rains, you get a lot of water all at once, and then you don't have any for, it could be a couple of weeks. And the shrubs and the trees and the grass that's over in that park over there that nobody waters are perfectly fine. They know what to do with that water. They're used to that kind of watering where the rain hits, it soaks in deep. Yeah, the upper 2-3 inches may be bone dry, but the roots aren't all up there. They're deep. And if you water it properly, those roots, as Jim just said, they're going to sink in deep. They're going to spread out. They're going to look for that moisture. They're going to anchor themselves in. They're going to figure out how they need to survive. And, again, we do too much to these things to baby them along, and then they never really toughen up to the point where they can survive on their own.
Yeah, good points. We talked a little bit about containers, but somebody has a very specific question on Alberta's pine that is in a very large container. Should they water it? Should they wrap the container? She's in Indianapolis.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, assuming it's an Alberta spruce, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, those things are hardy to like zone 3. I think they can probably stay frozen in a container for some period of time. I don't know though with the wind. I don't know if the wind would damage it.
I've seen some. If it's a dwarf Alberta spruce, hopefully it's the one I'm thinking of. That's the right one. I've seen them in the ground after 5 or 6 years. All of a sudden, we get a really dry, windy winter, and one side will just be copper by the time spring rolls around, because that one side that was on that windy bit got burned. And again, with those, if you're going to wrap something like that, don't wrap the needles up like you're baling it like a Christmas tree. If your container is, say 5 feet wide, put that wrap right out on the edge of the container, go straight up with the sides, just to keep the wind off of it. It doesn't mind if it's cold. It doesn't mind if it gets snow on it. It doesn't mind if the sun is shining. What it does mind is that really, really cold, bitter wind that hits it. So as long as you got something where the wind isn't going to smash up against it and really take the moisture out of those needles during the winter, basically create a barrier around it just to protect it from the wind, nothing else.
Awesome. Awesome. Here's a question. Somebody just typed it that I was going to ask myself, because we just had a webinar on planting bulbs, and how long before the freeze should you plant? So what about deciduous and or evergreen trees? How many weeks prior to before the ground freezes should you plant?
I'll tell you, in the Southeast, there's no reason not to continue to plant them. If they're hardy in your area, they're going to be better off in the ground than they are in that container.
Yep.
And so really there's no reason. If you can dig a hole from where I live from Richmond, Virginia, down the coast of Florida and over to East Texas, you can dig a hole. There's really no reason not to put the plant in the. Again, I'm going back though, making sure that you're not pushing the boundaries of that plant. I have 2 palms in my landscape, and they're both in containers because they're barely hardy here, and that being in containers allows me to put them on the porch or put them inside. So but again, if it's hardy in your area and you could dig the hole, put it in the ground.
Yeah. Yep, agreed.
Okay, agreed. So you said another magic word, dig a hole. And we all know that there has been a lot of controversy and changing of methodology or recommendations. So if you're planting a shrub and it's 1 feet wide, the root ball, how big should the hole be and how deep should it be? And should you backfill with the soil you took out, or should you amend it before you put it back in? There's a lot of controversy about that one.
Go ahead, Sam, and I'll give mine.
Oh yeah, sure. No, that's a pretty big question. Man, I don't even know where to start on this one. Okay, for shrubs, if you're going to dig that hole, and say you're in the shrub that you bought was grown in a very, very light, open soil media, and the soil you're planting it into is a lot heavier. Midwest, we have a lot of sandy loam, sandy clay loam. There's a lot of, the clay loam's more than the sandy loam. Sandy loam, you're lucky. We get a lot of clay in the Chicago area, so your soil it's heavy. If you slice down with that shovel and you end up with this, the soil almost looks smooth when you dig, and you have this really light open soil media that now the shrub is in, and you just plop that in the hole. Those roots are going to have a tendency to grow in a circle. It's least resistance. They're not going to want to push through that really hard soil layer. So they're going to hit that edge and go, it's easier just to grow back around. And you'll end up with these girdling roots that it'll be okay for a couple of seasons. Then all of a sudden everything will start dying, and you go to pull it out and you realize everything is wrapped in a circle, nothing ever rooted out. So if you're digging something and your soils are a bit heavier, you need to rough up the edges of that hole. You could dig it a little bit wider than you need. Break up the sides of that soil. Make sure the soil is nice and loose on the edges, so as those roots try to expand, they have somewhere to go. Same thing with the bottom of the hole. You don't need to dig an extra 2 feet and amend the soil all the way up. You need to break that up, though, to make sure that it's loose enough so that the soils or the roots, when they hit that soil, have somewhere to go. Otherwise, you might as well leave it in the pot and throw it in the ground and just replace it every couple of years. Ball and burlap, same type of thing. Take the burlap off. I prefer that, but you need to rough up the edges of that hole to let those roots start to expand. Give it somewhere to go. What were the other parts of that question? Oh, amending.
About amending the soil, yeah.
Amending. Most soils, I guess the rule of thumb, what you don't want to do is end up with a bunch of interface layers, which is a dramatic change from one type of soil to another type of soil. So you have the container soil, you have a narrow band of amended soil, and then you have your native soil. That's 3 different zones that root now has to go through. That's 3 different zones that are going to have different moisture characteristics and moisture holding characteristics. What you really try to do when you get that plant in the ground is give it as much of a homogeneous soil
from the root system all the way through the soil profile. So it's happy and the roots don't mind going where they want to go. If you have too many different layers for them to go through, and your amended layer dries out faster than the root ball or the native soil, you could end up what's known as air pruning, where they'll grow into this dry area. There'll be too much oxygen. Those little tiny feeder roots that are just stretching out will dry up, die, and then will never make it through that into the native soil where the moisture is or out of the root ball. So you will again end up with this tiny root ball that never gets any bigger. And you could either have that shrub, die a few years later, or be severely stunted or slowed in its growth, where it takes far longer to get where it's going than it should.
Okay, Jim, any additions?
Well, yeah, I think for me, I will typically just show myself mixing. What I did in my consultation work, I show is that I'll frequently, when I start a new bed, put down a layer of compost around, and then as things get planted, a little bit of that compost gets mixed in. But I'm actually a big proponent of most people probably don't need any amendments whatsoever. But I also know that people go and buy a $50 plant and it makes them feel good that they're doing so. And so if I can just get them down to don't buy the bags of planting mix with the fertilizer in them, because why would you buy something that has fertilizer in it in September? I actually went to one of the box stores last week and I had a hard time finding something that didn't have a weed preventer or a fertilizer in it. And I don't want to be fertilizing them at the wrong time of year. Just a basic compost. If you want to put a shovel full of compost in a planting hole to make yourself feel like you did something for your $50 investment, go for it. But the vast majority of people in the United States, we're blessed that even our red clay and our gray clay and our sandy loam plants grow. East of the Rockies, plants grow and they willingly do it.
Exactly. And if you're growing something for your zone, then the soil, the ground is already okay for them. Yeah. So you don't have to overthink it.
Yeah. And we're, talking about encore azaleas, which are in bloom here, right now. They happen to like our soil pH across the Southeast. So again, it's that right plant, right place thing as well.
Exactly. So here's a question. I have seen landscapers leave the wire on bald plants when they plant. Is that okay?
Personally, I don't really like planting that giant chandelier in the ground. There are certain trees that have really, really fibrous root systems that may be okay. In the long run, I would prefer not. I mean, everybody has seen, hopefully everybody's seen that tree that grows too close to the chain link fence, and then it goes through, and you've got that metal literally going through the tree, and how kind of gnarly and wounded it looks when it does that. If you leave that cage on underground, that's going on with the root system. You can end up girdling the root system. You could, which basically means it's too tight and you're cutting off circulation from the outer edge of the root to the tree. And really, it won't happen when the tree is very small. It'll happen as it gets larger. So if you have this root that's 5-6 inches in diameter that's leading out, it has a ton of feeder roots on the end that are supplying a major portion of that tree, and that starts to lose its connection to the tree. One, it's just not going to be able to supply the nutrients and the moisture that tree needs anymore. And two, it could be a major issue structurally if that big chunk of root dies right next to the crown. Now you're going to lose your connection and your stabilization that root that's stretched out 20, 30 feet through the soil is now providing. So you could end up in a situation where that tree may blow over in a heavy wind or topple with a snow load. Even with the burlap, yeah, it may break down over time, but that's when those little roots are trying to work their way out, and as they expand and then they can't push that burlap out of the way. If you're dealing with the soil that's going to hold itself together when you remove that, I would just as soon put it in the ground, cut all that nonsense off, get it out of the ground, let those roots open back up, give them a good connection to the soil that's next to them, and let them root out, and they'll do their thing. If you're worried about stabilization, stake it for a season or two, and then take those away after, again, after maybe 2 seasons. Those roots will be anchored enough to the soil next to it. They'll be able to support the canopy of that tree without having it tip over, without it blowing over. It should be just fine.
So another one talks about salt damage. Trees were not really, or shrubs were not really made to cohabitate with the salt we put on our city streets. So first of all, right plant, right place, right? Maybe don't put it where it's going to get a lot of salt damage. Any other suggestions there?
Go ahead, Sam. We don't have to salt hardly anything here.
Yeah, I was going to ask. It's like, do you ever have to deal with that? Because we deal with
Well,
it.
I will tell you, we have a different salt issue here, and that is pets. We see salts. One of the landscape job I worked on for years was an apartment complex, and there were more dogs in the apartments than there were people. And so we have to have salt tolerant plants in those types of, just with male dogs. So, but you can address it in terms of, snow or, winter.
Oh, absolutely. If you're talking about, the rock salt that gets applied to our roads very liberally up here. I mean, it can be pretty bad at times. And I'll go at this from 2 different angles. There's one, the municipalities, city streets, things that you have no control over. With those, if you have plants right up against, if you're on a city street, if you're on a public road, and there's going to be a lot of salt damage or salt spread that could potentially get into your planting beds if they're right along the edge of the road. You do a couple of things. You could use a silt fence and put that along the edge of the road to keep that salt from spraying in. The problem is if you get heavy snow, the plows aren't going to care that that's there, and they could just crush it. Not planting right up against the road is an option. Leave a couple of feet, maybe 2 or 3 feet at most. Should be enough of a buffer where it's either just mulch, turf, something that can handle the salt a little bit better than some of the more sensitive shrubs. That could be an option. But again, if you're along a public road, public highway, there's only so much you can do. And because the city guys are going to do what they do to make sure it's safe. The roads are safe. No one's going to slip and fall. No one's going to slide into another vehicle, that type of thing. If you're dealing with your own property, whether you work for a campus or you're a landscaper, you're salting other things, sidewalks, driveways, something like that. There are several different salts you could use that are much less harmful to plant material. Magnesium chloride, potassium chloride, even calcium chloride. They're less harmful in the long run to plants and soil than sodium chloride. Plants need calcium to grow. They need magnesium. They need potassium. All of those things are very beneficial to plants in small amounts. The chloride part is the bad part. But with some soil flushing and using them in the correct amounts, you need far less calcium chloride and magnesium chloride to deal with snow and ice management than you do sodium chloride. You probably maybe a quarter of the amount to get the same level of control. So you're using less, it's less harmful. You could do that. There are also some chemicals, I think it's called, is it MSMA, MC? I forget what it is. There's a magnesium acetate that's also used as a pre-treat. It's very, very, it's hardly harmful to plants at all. It's very gentle on plant material. You can use that. It's applied before it snows. You shovel, nothing binds to your concrete, nothing. It prevents the ice and snow from binding to the concrete, binding to the asphalt. You can scrape it off clean. The sun comes out a little bit, burns whatever little bit is left off, and you're left with clean surface. There's a couple of product things you could do. Protecting young trees and shrubs with silt fence is a possibility. Just have to make sure you do that in the right locations. But it's definitely a problem, and it happens.
Yeah, it does. Okay, I always try to keep this in an hour, and believe it or not, we are at an hour. The time always flies, and I think what I hear for summarizing is don't cut back shrubs before winter. Let them go till next year. Don't fertilize after, say, June. Mulch correctly. Don't volcano mulch. And for the most part, you really don't have to do anything more to your shrubs. Maybe protect them from wind, plant them in the right place, and then you won't have to worry about that quite as much. So, yeah, anything else as a summarization or generality on this topic?
I do like to have like a frost protection blanket on hand or some sort of, because I did say, I don't want you to do anything now to get ready for it, but I think there might be a period in the winter though where it is well below your normal lows, and you probably do have, some things that you'll want to protect at that time. So do come armed for the battle is in January. The battle's not in November. So having a frost protection blanket or something to throw over vulnerable plants, is good to have on hand. But other than that, really, there's not much to do this time of year. I think it's panic.
Yeah, I was going to add, if your plants are healthy, they're thriving going into winter, you shouldn't have to worry about it. If they're weak, something went wrong, they're not the right plant for that area, you might have problems. But if they're properly suited, they're growing well, they're nice, tough, well-rooted shrubs, you shouldn't have to worry about them going through winter. They know what they need to do to get through winter into the next spring.
Yeah.
Very good. Very excellent information, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure. We thank you for all sharing all your knowledge. It's very good. And so now everybody can just chill and look forward to the next gardening season. Yeah, don't overstress about your shrubs. So that's wonderful. And thank you to everybody who joined in. And hopefully you guys have a great weekend. Enjoy the fall weather.